My mother stood by my brother's casket, looking at his pale face, and then she turned to me and said in a completely calm, matter-of-fact tone that Jason should have been the one to survive that accident instead of me because he was the only one who truly cared about this family, and now my life officially belongs to them so that I can somehow atone for the sin of staying in one piece. Those words are still ringing in my ears even though it's been only a week since that moment. And I still can't understand how in such a short period of time everything I've built over the years has turned into some endless nightmare from which there is no escape. It all started 3 weeks ago when Jason and I decided to drive out of town to discuss the affairs of our family firm, which he managed with an iron fist while I handled secondary issues and mostly tried to stay out of my father's sight. It was raining heavily, the road was slick, and I only remember the blinding headlights of an oncoming truck, the sharp screech of brakes, and the way the world around us began to flip, turning into a mess of metal and shattered glass. When I came to in the hospital, they told me I only had a few scratches and a mild concussion, while Jason died instantly because the main impact was on the driver's side. And at that moment I didn't yet know that this news would be the signal for my parents to start a real war against me. My brother was always the golden child, that perfect son whom Linda and Robert practically worshipped, and he really did carry the weight of their huge house, their credit card debts, and all their whims on his shoulders, while I was always considered something of a burdensome attachment to his success. Immediately after the funeral, the atmosphere in the house became so heavy that the air felt physically thick, and every time I walked into the kitchen, my parents would simply stop talking, staring at me as if I had committed a crime just by continuing to breathe. Yesterday evening, my father called me into Jason's office, where it still smelled like his cologne, and laid out a stack of papers on the desk that turned out to be documents for the transfer of my apartment to cover my brother's debts, which I hadn't even known existed until that very moment. He said that since I survived, I am now obligated to take on all of Jason's financial responsibilities, including the upkeep of their country house and paying their endless bills, and he absolutely does not care that I have my own life, my own plans, and my own savings that I've been putting away for years. When I tried to object, saying that this was unfair and that I wasn't to blame for what happened on that road, he simply slammed his fist on the table and screamed that justice died along with my brother, and that I am nothing but a pale shadow that happened to remain alive. My mother stood in the doorway and just nodded, confirming every word he said, and in her eyes I saw no grief for her son, but rather a cold calculation and a deep hatred for the one who couldn't replace their favorite. I am sitting in my room, looking at these papers, and I realize that I have exactly 1 month to either completely submit to their will and become their slave for the next few decades or find a way to leave, but then I will lose everything I have, including the remnants of my family. This whole situation feels like some surreal movie to me, but the cold sweat on my back and the shaking in my hands tell me that this is reality, and with every passing hour, the tension in this house only grows, turning my life into a slow torture. They have already started disposing of my things. Yesterday I discovered that my mother gave my old watch, which I bought with my first paycheck, to our neighbor's son, arguing that I don't need it anymore since I will now be living by their rules. I feel like I'm being sucked into this vortex of someone else's guilt and someone else's expectations, and the scariest part is that I'm starting to catch myself thinking that they are right, and I really am guilty for not being the one in that grave instead of Jason. But inside me, a tiny spark of protest still flickers, preventing me from just giving up and signing those papers, even though I understand that every step I take toward resistance triggers a new outburst of rage from them, which is becoming increasingly uncontrollable. This month will be the deciding factor, and I don't know if I have the strength to oppose 2 people who gave me life but are now ready to take it away piece by piece, simply because it's more convenient for them to handle their grief that way. This morning at breakfast, Robert said that if I don't sign the documents for the apartment by the end of the week, they will sue me, accusing me of negligence that led to Jason's death. Even though the police closed the case long ago and ruled it an accident, they are ready to resort to any lie, any betrayal, just to maintain the level of comfort that my brother provided for them, and to them, I am just a tool that suddenly happened to be at hand at the most convenient moment. It has been 10 days since the funeral, and the atmosphere in this house has shifted from a heavy, suffocating grief into a calculated, systematic pressure that makes me feel like I am being erased from my own life 1 hour at a time. My father, Robert, has taken to sitting in the living room for hours, not watching television or reading, but just staring at the door whenever I walk by, his eyes tracking my every movement with a look of such profound disappointment that I can almost feel the weight of it pressing down on my shoulders. He hasn't returned to work at the firm yet, claiming that he is too devastated to function. But he has plenty of energy to spend his afternoons on the phone with his lawyer, discussing the legal avenues for reclaiming what he calls the family assets that are currently tied up in my name. I found out yesterday that he actually called my bank and tried to gain access to my personal savings account by claiming he was my legal representative because of my unstable emotional state following the accident, which is a complete lie. But the bank teller sounded genuinely confused when I called to clarify that I am a 32-year-old man perfectly capable of managing my own finances. My mother, Linda, has taken a different approach that is somehow even more draining, because she spends her days moving through the house like a ghost, rearranging my things and packing up my clothes into cardboard boxes as if I have already agreed to move out and give them my apartment. When I confront her about it, she doesn't argue or scream like my father does. She just looks through me with these hollow, watery eyes and says that Jason would have wanted the family to stay together under one roof, and that my apartment is an unnecessary luxury when they are facing such financial uncertainty. She talks about my brother as if he were a saint who sacrificed everything for them, conveniently forgetting the times he would call me late at night, drunk and sobbing, telling me how he felt like a literal ATM for two people who never bothered to ask him how he was actually doing. They have created this version of him that is untouchable and perfect, and every time I speak, every time I breathe, I am failing to live up to that impossible standard, and they make sure I know it by ignoring my presence until they need something or until they want to remind me of how much I owe them for the simple fact of being alive. The financial details are starting to surface now, and they are much worse than I ever imagined, because it turns out Jason wasn't just managing the firm. He was shuffling money around to cover up the fact that my parents had spent nearly their entire retirement fund on a lifestyle they couldn't afford, including that massive country house and 3 different club memberships. He was drowning in debt trying to keep their illusions alive, and now that he's gone, the creditors are starting to circle like vultures, and my parents see me not as a son who just lost his brother, but as a life raft that they can strip for parts to keep themselves afloat. Robert told me this morning that he expects the first payment for the property taxes on the country house by Friday, and when I told him I didn't have that kind of liquid cash available, he looked me dead in the eye and asked how I could be so selfish as to keep my petty savings, while my mother is on the verge of a nervous breakdown. I feel like I am losing my mind because the logic in this house is so warped that I am starting to question my own reality, wondering if I really am the monster they say I am for wanting to keep the apartment I worked 60 hours a week for 5 years to buy. I haven't been back to my own place since the accident because they insisted I stay here for mutual support. But now I realize it was a trap to keep me isolated and under their constant surveillance, so I wouldn't have the chance to talk to anyone who might tell me that what they are doing is insane. My friends have been texting me, asking where I am and why I'm not answering my calls, but Linda has started taking my phone from the charging station at night and going through my messages, deleting anything that she deems disruptive to my recovery. I caught her doing it last night, and when I snatched the phone back, she didn't even look guilty. She just said she was protecting me from people who don't understand the complexity of our grief, and that I should be grateful she cares enough to filter out the noise. There is this terrifying sense of urgency now because the end of the month is approaching, and the legal documents Robert wants me to sign are sitting on the dining table like a ticking time bomb, and every meal we eat is spent in a silence so thick it feels like it's choking me. I can see the way they look at each other when they think I'm not watching. A silent communication between two people who have decided that my life is a fair price to pay for their comfort, and I am terrified that if I don't find a way out soon, I will eventually just break and give them everything just to make the staring and the guilt-tripping stop. I tried to go to my car today just to drive around and clear my head, but I found that Robert had taken my keys and locked them in Jason's old safe, claiming that I am too traumatized to be behind the wheel after the crash and that it's for my own safety. It's a slow, methodical stripping away of my autonomy, and the worst part is that they do it with these expressions of mock concern, acting like they are the ones suffering while I am the one being difficult and ungrateful for their guidance. I spent the afternoon in the basement, looking through some of Jason's old personal files that weren't at the office, and I found something that made my blood run cold. A series of emails between him and a private investigator from just a month before the accident. It seems my brother was looking for a way out too, and he was uncovering things about my father's past business dealings that would explain why they are so desperate for me to sign those papers and take legal responsibility for the estate. I haven't confronted them yet because I need to know the full extent of what I found. But the tension in this house is reaching a breaking point where I feel like the walls are literally closing in on me. The 17th day since the accident was the day the mask of parental grief finally slipped completely, revealing a level of cold-blooded entitlement that I honestly didn't think human beings were capable of showing toward their own child. I spent the entire morning locked in the basement going through the rest of Jason's hidden files, and what I found was a systematic record of how my father, Robert, had been embezzling funds from the family business for over 3 years to pay off gambling debts he'd racked up in Atlantic City. Jason wasn't just working hard to keep the family afloat. He was literally blackmailed by our own father, who threatened to ruin the company and put dozens of people out of work if Jason didn't keep funneling money into Robert's private accounts to cover the losses. It explained the hollow look in Jason's eyes during our last Christmas together, and the way he had started looking at our father with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust that I hadn't understood at the time. I was sitting there on the cold concrete floor, holding a bank statement that showed a transfer of $50,000 made just 2 days before the crash. When the basement door creaked open and Robert stood there in the shadows, his face obscured but his posture radiating a sudden, violent energy. He didn't ask what I was doing. He just walked over, snatched the paper out of my hand, and looked at it for a second before ripping it into tiny pieces and dropping them onto my lap like they were pieces of trash. He told me that I had no right to go through things that didn't belong to me and that my morbid curiosity was an insult to the memory of a brother who was 10 times the man I will ever be. When I finally stood up and looked him in the eye, asking him how he could live with himself knowing he had spent Jason's life and was now trying to spend mine, he didn't even flinch or try to deny it. He just stepped closer, invading my personal space until I could smell the stale coffee and resentment on his breath, and told me that the only reason the family is in this position is because the wrong son was behind the wheel that night. He said that if Jason were here, he would have understood the necessity of protecting the family name at all costs. But because I am fundamentally selfish and weak, I am choosing to turn this into a drama instead of doing my duty. The confrontation moved to the kitchen when Linda heard the shouting, and instead of being the peacemaker I desperately hoped she would be, she turned on me with a ferocity that made my blood turn to ice. She stood by the sink, clutching a dish towel so hard her knuckles were white, and screamed that I was being ungrateful for the fact that I even survived the crash while her precious boy was rotting in the ground. She literally looked me in the face and told me that I should be thanking them every single day for the privilege of being alive, and that my refusal to sign over my apartment and my savings was proof that I didn't value the life I had been given back by fate. It was the most twisted logic I had ever heard, the idea that because I didn't die in that metal heap on the highway, I no longer had a right to my own autonomy or my own future. The argument escalated into a full-blown shouting match where Robert told me that I was a parasite who had spent 32 years taking from them and that this was the first time I was being asked to give something back, and my hesitation was a betrayal of our bloodline. He told me that if I didn't sign the documents by tomorrow morning, he would call the police and tell them that Jason had told him I was intentionally driving recklessly that night because I was jealous of his success, a lie so monstrous it left me speechless. They are so desperate to cover up the financial hole Robert dug that they are willing to frame their only living son for the death of their favorite one, all while maintaining the appearance of a grieving family to the outside world. I tried to leave, to just walk out the front door and never come back, but Robert had already called a security consultant he knows, a man named Miller who used to be a cop, and he was already parked at the end of the driveway, making it clear that I wasn't going anywhere until the family business was settled. I am currently trapped in my childhood bedroom, the very room where I used to dream about moving away and making something of myself, and I can hear them talking in low, urgent tones in the hallway about how to handle me if I continue to be difficult. The tension in this house is so high that I feel like the air is vibrating, and every time I hear a footstep outside my door, I wonder if this is the moment they stop using words and start using force. They have already disconnected the house's internet, and I suspect they've installed a signal jammer because my phone has no bars, leaving me completely isolated in this suburban prison they've built around me. It's been 20 days since the accident, and in less than 3 weeks, my parents have gone from mourning parents to predatory captors who view me as nothing more than a financial asset to be liquidated. I spent the night staring at the ceiling, thinking about the look on my mother's face when she called me ungrateful for surviving, and I realized that the people who raised me never actually loved me. They only loved the version of me that was convenient for them, and now that I am an obstacle to their comfort, I am something to be discarded or broken. I have one hidden laptop that they didn't find because it was tucked into the lining of my suitcase, and I am typing this out with the screen brightness turned all the way down, listening for the sound of the doorknob turning. I know that tomorrow morning is the deadline, and if I don't sign those papers, I don't know what Robert and his consultant are planning to do to make me comply, but the look in my father's eyes tells me that he has moved past the point of caring about my well-being. This isn't just about money anymore. It's about the fact that my existence is a constant reminder of their failure and their loss, and they want to punish me for the crime of continuing to exist when the person they actually cared about is gone. The morning of the deadline arrived with a cold, gray light that seemed to drain the remaining color from my childhood bedroom, and I spent the first few hours of the day just sitting on the floor with my hidden laptop, desperately trying to find a way to contact the outside world through the signal jammer they had clearly installed. Around 9 a.m., I heard the heavy thud of Miller's boots in the hallway, followed by the distinct sound of my father's voice. And then the lock on my door clicked open, which was something they hadn't done since they started this soft imprisonment 2 days ago. Robert walked in with a tray of food that looked like a peace offering but felt more like a last meal, and he sat down in my old desk chair, looking at me with a strange, tired expression that I couldn't quite decipher until he started speaking in a low, controlled voice. He told me that he didn't want things to go this far, and that he truly wished we could have settled this as a family. But since I was being stubborn, he had no choice but to bring in Miller to help oversee the transition of my assets. He placed the legal documents on the bed right next to me and handed me a pen, stating that if I signed now, they would let me leave with my car and a small portion of my savings. But if I refused, they would proceed with the police report about my alleged reckless driving that killed Jason. I looked at the papers and then back at him, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the paralyzing fear of his disapproval, but instead a cold, sharp clarity that comes when you realize the person you're dealing with has no soul left to appeal to. I told him that I knew about the embezzlement and the gambling debts, and I saw his face turn a shade of gray that was almost identical to the sky outside, but he didn't deny it. He just leaned forward and whispered that it didn't matter what I knew because no one would ever believe a traumatized, guilty son over a grieving father who had built this community's respect over 30 years. Then he dropped the real bombshell, the piece of information that changed everything and made my heart stop in my chest. He told me that Jason had a $5 million life insurance policy that he had taken out through the company, but there was a clause stating that if the death was caused by the criminal negligence of a family member, the payout would be voided unless the family settled the estate internally to avoid a public scandal. He was lying to me about the policy details, but I realized in that second what the real game was. They didn't just want my apartment and my savings. They needed me to sign a confession disguised as a financial waiver so they could claim the insurance money without the insurance company investigating the accident too closely. I felt a surge of adrenaline and realized I had to check one thing on my laptop while he was distracted. So I pretended to read the fine print of the documents, shielding my screen with my body, and managed to access a cached version of Jason's private cloud drive that I had cracked earlier. That's when I found the actual insurance document, and the twist hit me like a physical blow. Jason hadn't named my parents as the beneficiaries at all because 6 months ago, after he discovered Robert's theft, he had changed the primary beneficiary to me, with a specific note to the lawyers that the funds were to be used to protect the family legacy from my father's addiction. My parents didn't know this yet. They thought they were the beneficiaries and were just trying to scrub the accident of any negligence talk to ensure a smooth payout. But the reality was that they were fighting to protect a pot of money that already belonged to me. The moral dilemma I faced in that moment was suffocating, because if I told them the truth, I knew Robert and Miller would never let me leave that house alive, as I was now the only thing standing between them and $5 million that they desperately needed to stay out of prison. But if I signed the papers they gave me, I would be legally admitting to causing the accident, which would not only void the insurance policy Jason left for me but would also likely land me in jail for vehicular manslaughter once my father decided I was no longer useful. I looked up at Robert, who was checking his watch with an impatient flick of his wrist, and I realized that my mother was standing in the doorway now, her face a mask of cold anticipation, and I saw Miller's shadow hovering just behind her in the hall. They had me boxed in, and the month was almost up, and I had to make a choice between a lie that would destroy my life or a truth that might end it right here in this room. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me as I looked at the pen in my hand and then at the window, calculating the distance to the ground and wondering if I could make it to the woods behind the house before Miller could reach his car. I decided to play for time, so I told my father that I would sign, but only if my mother stayed in the room as a witness, which forced Miller to step back into the hallway for a moment to give us privacy. As my mother walked in and sat on the edge of the bed, looking at me with those eyes that held no love, I realized that I wasn't just fighting for my money or my apartment anymore. I was fighting for the version of Jason that they had tried to bury under their lies. I started to sign the first page, but I intentionally made the signature look shaky and wrong, and when Robert leaned in to complain, I grabbed the heavy glass paperweight from my old desk and slammed it down on his hand, the sound of bone breaking echoing through the room. It was the first time I had ever struck him, and the shock on his face was almost worth the consequences as I lunged for the door, knowing that this was the point of no return and that the next few minutes would determine if I ever saw the outside of this property again. I burst into the hallway, nearly knocking my mother over, and I could hear Miller shouting from downstairs as I scrambled toward the back staircase, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped animal. I felt the cold, damp air hit my lungs as I scrambled out of the basement window, the jagged glass tearing through my shirt and leaving a burning trail across my ribs. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the frantic, rhythmic pounding of my heart against my chest as I saw Miller's silhouette rounding the corner of the house. I didn't head for the driveway where my car was trapped behind the gates. Instead, I plunged into the dense thicket of trees that separated our property from the main road, my boots sinking into the mud and every snapping branch sounding like a gunshot in the silent morning air. I could hear Robert screaming from the house, a raw and guttural sound of pure animal rage that didn't sound like a father anymore, while Miller shouted instructions that I didn't stay to listen to because I knew that if he caught me now, there would be no more talk of papers or signatures. I reached the edge of the asphalt just as a delivery truck was slowing down for the bend, and I practically threw myself in front of it, the driver slamming on his brakes and cursing as I pulled myself into the passenger seat before he could even process what was happening. I told the man, a guy named Dave who looked about 50 and terrified, to just drive toward the police station in town, and as we pulled away, I saw Miller standing at the edge of the woods, staring at the departing truck with a look of cold, professional failure. The next 48 hours were a blur of fluorescent lights, stale coffee, and the endless repetition of my story to investigators who initially looked at me like I was the one having a breakdown until I handed over the laptop with Jason's encrypted files. When the detectives finally saw the records of Robert's embezzlement and the true nature of the life insurance policy Jason had left behind, the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from suspicion to a heavy, somber realization of the nightmare I had been living in. They sent a patrol car to the house, and while I stayed in a motel under an assumed name, I learned that Robert had tried to flee but was stopped at the gates, his hand still wrapped in a bloody towel from where I had broken it with the paperweight. Linda, however, had simply sat in the kitchen and refused to speak, even when they told her that her husband was being taken in for questioning regarding financial fraud and the potential coercion of a witness. The final blow came a week later when the insurance company's legal team contacted me directly to confirm that I was indeed the sole beneficiary of Jason's $5 million policy, and they informed me that the criminal negligence clause my father had mentioned was a complete fabrication designed to manipulate me into signing away my rights. It turned out that Jason had planned his exit months in advance, and he had left a video message in a hidden partition of his drive, which the police let me watch in a small, cramped office at the precinct. In the video, Jason looked tired and older than his years, and he told me that he knew our parents would come for me once he was gone because their greed was a bottomless pit that no amount of money could ever truly fill. He said he was sorry for leaving me to deal with them alone, but that the money was my shield, a way to buy back the freedom that they had been stripping away from both of us since we were children. I used a portion of that money to hire the best legal defense for myself to ensure the reckless driving claims were buried forever, and I watched from a distance as the family firm collapsed under the weight of Robert's debts and the pending criminal charges for his fraud. My parents lost the country house, the cars, and the social standing that they had valued more than my brother's life or my own sanity, and they are currently living in a small rented apartment in a different state, waiting for the final court dates that will likely send Robert to prison for several years. I haven't spoken to them since the day I ran out of that basement window, and I blocked their numbers after Linda sent me a single text message saying that Jason would be ashamed of what I've done to the family, as if the ruins of our lives were my fault and not the inevitable result of their own parasitic choices. I am sitting in my new apartment now, a place they will never find, looking out at a city skyline that feels both beautiful and incredibly lonely, realizing that I have all the financial security I ever dreamed of, but absolutely no one to share it with. The month has officially come to an end, and I have survived the crash, the grief, and the predatory whims of the people who were supposed to protect me. But the victory feels hollow and metallic, like a bell that's been cracked. I realized that the real tragedy wasn't just the accident on that rainy road, but the fact that I had to lose my entire family just to find out that I was the only one who ever truly cared about any of them. I think about Jason every single day, and I wonder if he knew that by saving me financially, he was also condemning me to a life of looking over my shoulder, wondering if everyone I meet is just another person looking for a way to use me. There's a philosophical weight to surviving when the people you love wish you hadn't, and I'm starting to understand that I didn't just walk away from a car wreck. I walked away from a version of myself that believed in the inherent goodness of blood ties. I am 32 years old. I am a multimillionaire. And I am a ghost in my own life, drifting through a world where the only people who ever truly knew me are either dead or behind bars. I've realized that money can buy a lot of things. Freedom, safety, and a clean slate. But it can't buy back the silence of a house that used to be full of life, even if that life was a lie. Sometimes I find myself driving at night, specifically when it's raining, just to feel that same tension again. Because in those moments of near danger, I feel closer to my brother than I do in the safety of my expensive new reality. I'm not sure where I go from here, or if I'll ever be able to trust a human being again without wondering what their price is. But I know that I am finally free, even if that freedom tastes like ash and old regrets.